For our next session, I'll be handing over to Peter Lacy from Accenture to discuss building back better to recover stronger from COVID-19. But before we throw to Peter Lacy in London, I'm honoured to introduce the President of the Republic of Botswana, His Excellency Dr. Magwitsi Ike Masisi.
Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. I am deeply honored for the kind invitation to address this high-level panel on a very appropriate topic under the theme, Raise SDG Ambition to Build Back Together and Recover Stronger. I'd like to seize this opportunity to thank the United Nations Global Compact for convening this important summit, marking the 20th anniversary of this noble initiative, which was established by the late Secretary General Kofi Annan. I am particularly pleased that we are able to meet virtually today, despite constraints imposed on us by the coronavirus pandemic. The future of our global economies and societies, and indeed the spirit of partnership as enshrined in the United Nations Global Compact, has never been so challenged. It is clear that besides the current health and numerous residual consequences brought about by COVID-19, this pandemic will have far-reaching socio-economic impact on our lives. It will no doubt significantly reverse the development gains realized over very many decades. Your Excellencies, as the global economic growth shrinks, so will our domestic economies. It is posited that we are headed for the worst recession ever in living memory. The global South, especially the already vulnerable countries, most of which are in my own region in Africa, will certainly face a Herculean task in an attempt to move to a speedy recovery. Given this difficult situation, we must nonetheless prepare for the medium and long-term socio-economic effects of this pandemic. We need to work tirelessly towards expeditious recovery, while also rebuilding resilient economies far more capable to withstand any other unforeseen future shocks. This pandemic has revealed the extent and depth of the interconnectivity and interdependence of our global village. It is clear that we need to work together as the international community, governments, private sector, civil society, and indeed through innovative partnerships to effectively respond to this pandemic, because no country can do it alone. Your Excellencies, in Botswana, my government has taken decisive action to contain the crisis, while at the same time enacting policies to support local businesses, in particular small and medium-sized enterprises during this difficult time. We are all mindful of the fact that the road to recovery will be long and arduous, and without sustainable private-public partnerships, governments alone cannot accomplish what is needed to rebound. This is where the United Nations Global Compact Office has a comparative advantage as an ideal platform to galvanize productive partnerships with the private sector. In this regard, I commend the United Nations Global Compact for leveraging private business engagement through the Global Compact local networks to ensure that we remain focused in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, by 2030. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, by way of encouragement, I want to believe that despite the enormity of this pandemic, we have been tested before by other major calamities and global economic downturns from which we can draw lessons. Let us therefore remain steadfast in our resolve to overcome the challenges that lie ahead. The good news is that we already have a global blueprint in the form of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which was unanimously embraced by all member states of the United Nations in 2015. Therefore, we need not reinvent the wheel, but simply recalibrate this existing plan to ensure that it is fit for purpose, to enable us to effectively address the challenges posed by the coronavirus pandemic. I, therefore, urge the private sector as a strategic partner to governments to fulfill its role in driving economic growth and development. In particular, it is imperative that the private sector leaders do their utmost to incorporate the SDGs and the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact into their business strategies and operations. In conclusion, I am optimistic that all the participants in this Leaders Summit will engage candidly and share concrete solutions that will give impetus to the accelerated implementation of the SDGs by 2030. Let us work together to rebuild a better world in the spirit of leaving no one behind. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you to President Masisi. Welcome to all of you around the world. We live in interesting times. As President Masisi articulated, the threat of backtracking on the global development agenda remains extremely real. We have a window of opportunity to mitigate climate change, reduce inequalities, strengthen social protection systems, and eliminate all forms of discrimination in every manner it exists, from biases to what we see currently around the world in terms of the backlash against racism. Corporate leaders need to hold each other accountable. We need to have sustained change far after the current protests that we see today have ended. This is critical to our progress on Agenda 2030. And in this second CEO panel of the UN Global Compact Leaders Summit, we aim to discuss how we go about raising the bar on the SDG ambition to build back better and to recover stronger. I'm really excited and very grateful to a fantastic panel who've given their time to us today. I think it's probably the most global panel that we've had so far during the Leaders Summit, with leaders joining us from Johannesburg, from Singapore, from Hong Kong, from London, and from Stockholm. So let me introduce the panel. Delighted to be joined by Helena Helmersson, who is the CEO of H&M Group. Amongst the number of executive roles, I think it's fascinating to see that Helena actually had the role of Chief Sustainability Officer within H&M and has pioneered much of the activity that the fashion player has pushed forward in recent years. Secondly, delighted to be joined by Fani, the CEO of Investec, very important financial services player and investor down originally from South Africa, but with a global footprint. Thirdly, delighted to have Jean-Pascal Tricoire, who is the chairman and CEO of Schneider Electric, someone who has been passionate for many years about sustainability with the UN, with the World Economic Forum, on everything from climate change and energy efficiency to something close to my heart, which is the circular economy. And last but absolutely by no means least, Verghese, the CEO of Olam International, headquartered in Singapore. Olam is a global leader in food and agribusiness, and that is Sunny's passion, rethinking the future of sustainable agricultural and food systems. So I hope we're in for a good debate. Let me begin first by talking about raising the ambition of business on sustainable development. And the question I'm going to put to you in each of you in different ways is, what are the changes in your company and your industry that can genuinely raise ambition and accelerate the integration of SDGs into your business, as well as impact against some of those metrics. So Helena, when we last spoke, you talked about sustainability as something that H&M thinks about end to end, especially in the context of things like living wages and jobs. You know, I think you told me the other day you have more than 1 million people that you are driving livelihoods for. How do you think about the sustainable development ambition at H&M? And also give us a flavor, because this is very live, came up yesterday. We are in the middle of COVID. There is a downturn globally in terms of demand. You have a very extensive supply chain where you create many livelihoods. How do you manage those tensions?
Great. What a good question. A few years ago, we started to reshape our sustainability strategy. And one of the kind of fundamentals for that was then the SDGs. So we were looking at how can we either directly or indirectly contribute to those in a better way. And the key to that sustainability strategy was to both kind of deal with inequalities, decent jobs, and growth of the economies, and kind of transform ourselves to a more circular business, and in the end, a climate positive business. Because I believe it's easy to kind of silify the two questions. Either you try to operate within the planetary boundaries, or you try to really contribute to economic growth and work for better jobs. But if you put them all together, it becomes more challenging. But I do believe that's kind of the only way to try to solve the biggest challenges that we see. And we also see that in COVID, that obviously when consumption goes down, there are workforces in developing countries that don't have jobs. So how do we kind of come together and solve the holistic picture? And we, as many others, obviously, it's been extraordinary times during COVID, and I believe we have learned a lot. And I guess I'm not the only one who now feel when we start to recover that you want to do things better. You do want to see what have we learned and how can we not only go back to that normal, but to a much better kind of normal. And I think the fundament in what we have learned is that the system showed that we were quite vulnerable. And if I look at H&M Group, of course, it's the question about business models and how that can kind of develop to be more resilient going forward. And I do think that the crisis has highlighted some areas, of course, digitalization, but also the need for circular business models, which for us is something that we are aiming to try out more and to accelerate. And also how can we kind of offer and reach customers in new ways, also through services or things like that. But I also think that the crisis has highlighted the need for more collaboration. And I think that new collaboration has sprung out from the crisis. If you look at the call for action from ILO as one example, or how we have collaborated with the Red Cross to be more social media or whatever it can be, but definitely a new type of collaborations, which I think will be key for us also going forward. And that is something that we as a company are aiming to develop further.
Excellent, Helena. Thank you very much. And maybe just to push you on the vulnerability that we see in systems and the need to be more resilient in building back better. Could you give us an example of where you're planning to build back better differently as a result of what you've learned through the COVID crisis?
Yeah, one is, of course, linked to the circularity thought. And that's also how can you look at more kind of sources for income than physical garment flows, but it's also to improve the physical garment flow. So how can you kind of make that more sustainable and less dependent on natural resources? And how can you make use of fibers over and over again, and of course, how can we secure jobs in a better way, and the importance of working close with suppliers and other partners in the industry to also secure that economic growth and have a dialogue with the governments if needed, if we need to reskill or kind of develop the kind of jobs that we see. So it's kind of a quite holistic agenda, I would say.
Very clear. Thank you very much for that. So, Sunny, coming to you, I know living wages are something that's important in some of the agricultural value chains that you operate in, things like fair trade in cocoa, and looking at living incomes in supply chains across the board in agriculture. Tell us a little bit about how you've been tackling those issues, child labour, fair wages, as well as how in agricultural value chains, more broadly, you're raising the ambition on sustainable development. Sunny, I think you might still be on mute.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now, Peter?
Now you're back. Yeah, we can.
Okay. My apologies. So I think the starting point is for the company to have a clear purpose. And by purpose, I mean the company should have a cause. There's a problem to solve. And this is why we come to work every day. And at Olam, that purpose is about reimagining global food and agricultural systems, which means how do we try and help produce more food, feed, and fiber to meet the growing needs of a larger population estimated at 9.5 billion by 2050 without destroying the planet. So how do you produce more food, feed, and fiber on a sustainable basis? I'll go specifically to the question that you just alluded to, which is about living wages. And in farming and agricultural systems, this is a big, big issue. So if you look at the Côte d'Ivoire cocoa production supply chain systems, which is the world's largest producer of cocoa, there are millions of smallholder farmers involved and engaged in cocoa production. Their average household income today is about $2,300 per household. $2,300 is just barely around the poverty line, as defined at $1.90 per capita per day. We have an ambition to raise that to $7,300, which we have estimated as the living wage in that context and that environment for a household of four. Now, if you look at that, our target is that by 2030, we will move 150,000 cocoa farmers in Ghana and in Côte d'Ivoire to that living wage of $7,300. And through a variety of measures and ways of, so for example, today we have in 2018 delivered about 64,000 cocoa improvement plans to farmers. 240,000 farmers have been educated on good agricultural practices. We have a child labor monitoring and remediation system right at the farm gate that allows us to improve the education and sensibility of farmers on child labor, and then putting in place a monitoring and remediation system that can eliminate child labor. Our target is that by 2030, we will have no child labor in the cocoa ecosystems that we are responsible for. That's the second goal. The third is we have calculated the amount of greenhouse gas emissions required to produce a ton of cocoa, or in Helena's case, a ton of cotton. So in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, if you're producing a ton of cotton, the carbon emissions for us is about 6.6 tons, 6.62 tons of carbon dioxide emission. If you ship that cotton now to a mill in the US, 8,800 kilometers, only 2% of the carbon emissions is coming from transporting that cotton from Côte d'Ivoire to the US. 98% is coming from agricultural practices in terms of the use of intensive till, the use of fertilizers, agrochemicals, all of that put together accounts for 98% of the carbon emissions. So how do we reduce the carbon intensity per ton of cotton supplied, a ton of cocoa produced, or a ton of coffee produced? So if you want ambition to develop, and I want to close with this last point, the UN, given its convening power, has done a remarkable job in the last many years to come up with some miraculous agreements. The UN SDG is a miraculous agreement, 194 countries agreeing to 17 goals, 230 targets. The UN Climate Accord is a miraculous achievement, 193 or 194 countries signing up. And in 2010, we had under the UN Biodiversity Convention, the Aichi biodiversity targets. We set ourselves 5 strategic goals, 20 targets, and 147 metrics. These are all miracles. 2 countries can't come and agree on anything, but to come and agree on some very granular targets and milestones. But the pity is that today, we are going to this year end the biodiversity target. We were supposed to achieve those 20 targets in 2020. Against the 20 targets, we will achieve 4. No single country has achieved more than 3 of those biodiversity targets. So why is it? And if you look at the traction on UN SDGs, we are far behind the curve. If you look at the traction on UN Paris Climate Accord, we have no chance of achieving a 2 degrees, let alone a 1.5 degrees global warming. So I have been thinking about why is it going wrong? If we can get all these countries come up with these fantastic agreements, why are we not able to deliver? We are not able to deliver because we are not achieving change at the individual level. If I'm not going to be the change that I want to see in others, there is 0 chance of us achieving any of these things. If my company is not going to be involved in changing, we are not going to change. If the sectors are not involved and we can't collaborate with civil society and NGOs, as well as academic institutions and government and policy makers, we can only talk about this and continue to beat our breasts, but we're not going to really affect change and deliver results. We need to have sustainability at the heart of a business as an integral strategy of a business, not as a risk management mitigation tool, not as an afterthought.
Excellent. Thank you, Sunny. That's very helpful. And that point about individual leadership and the role we all play within the system in driving change, I think it will resonate. Later on, I want to come back to you and talk about how you reconcile and manage the trade-offs, for example. I think great example of driving up living wages, but also it comes with cost. You need to take shareholders on a journey, customers on a journey. I'd like to come back and talk about that later. So let me move now to Fani from Investec. Fani, I think from the perspective of all of the range of things that I've seen across the board at Investec, your clean energy transition in South Africa is particularly impressive in raising the ambition on the transition that an entire continent needs to make. But I also think it would be wrong, given what we're seeing around the world at the moment, around race and around racism, around riots in different parts of the world, a real uprising and an awakening of consciousness of us tackling racism. I think it would be really important for you to comment on that as well. So do feel free to comment on both.
Okay, let me start first by talking about racism. Obviously, racism offends our values as Investec. We do believe that it also offends our sense of justice and our sense of common humanity. It really is important for business leaders to be unequivocal about the moral imperative of fighting for equality. So the struggle against racism that we see today is really a struggle against inequality generally, because racism manifests in the damage to dignity of people. It manifests in unequal or reduced access to education, to job opportunities, to healthcare systems. As an example, with COVID-19, we can see around the world how COVID-19 affects different people differently because of their economic status, because, as I say, inequality is pervasive and racism is but one element of inequality. So this moment is not just a moment to pause and reflect, as most people have argued. We do believe that this is a moment where there's a call for decisive action, not a moment to call around non-racialism, but really a moment to deal with anti-racism as a call for action. 44 years ago today, in South Africa, we had what we call the Soweto protests or the Soweto riots, where people stood up against a system of racial oppression called apartheid. It was a fundamental revolt against discrimination. And in 1994, that action, with other actions, of course, that were taken, led to the dawn of democracy in South Africa. The first time, somebody like myself had the right to vote, as were millions of our people. So these moments are particularly important because they can be catalysts for fundamental change. In our country, our constitution enshrined a call for action around equality. As an example, equality not only in education, in workplaces. We have, as an example, what is called the Employment Equity Act, where like Investec are requested to have very clear plans that are quantifiable, both in terms of numbers and timeframes to achieve appropriate diversity. So this moment can be that moment on racism for the world, for leaders specifically, to commit to make a fundamental change, not just change because you have people in the streets, but really a fundamental commitment to do things differently and to make a different contribution around racism. This is an important moment for the world, I believe. If I pivot back to your first question, which deals with clean energy, clearly we live at the southern tip of Africa, where you see the effects of poverty, where you see the effects of underdevelopment. And energy is one of the more critical aspects of leveraging a sense and a momentum around development. But in most emerging countries, including South Africa, fossil fuel is still the driver of energy within countries. So to seek to move away quite radically from fossil fuel dependence requires innovative solutions. And as a bank, we have taken the view that not only is it the right thing to do, but we will make sure that we can see business opportunity out of the need for clean energy. Africa as a whole requires quite a significant move towards clean energy. At Investec last year, for instance, we participated in renewable energy projects to the value of about £1 billion. And we continue to see opportunity to assist in that transition. So the way we see our role is that as a bank, we can help in mobilizing resources. And those resources could be in quite a number of categories. Resources, first and foremost, in the skills of our people. Banks have some of the brightest people that can come up with innovative solutions. We try to innovate around what projects would make sense and how we bring capital into those projects as a consequence. The second element of what we do is we work with our clients to help in the transition towards a cleaner energy environment. We play quite a significant advocacy role as a bank in encouraging our clients to make the transition as quickly as possible. And the third area of importance around not only climate change, but also around SDGs in general, is the issue of measurement. Can we agree on a set of measures that are common, that can be published, so that there is a level of accountability? So on those three scores as a bank, we play quite a critical role in trying to move the agenda forward.
Excellent, Fani. Thank you very much. And some very, very clear messages, I think, there in terms of anti-racism. I was looking yesterday at an interview that was done in the UK, and your point about the time for action is absolutely spot on. We've had 3 or 4 different reviews of how to tackle racism systemically in different institutions, and people are asking, what should we do? We know what we need to do. The reviews are many, many times. Now is the time to act. And I think it's the same in business as it is in government as well. Very well put and said. So moving on to Jean-Pascal, I'm going to give you also, Jean-Pascal, the first question that we've had come in, as well as tackling some of the areas that you've been most famous for pioneering, and Schneider Electric's been famous for pioneering, Jean-Pascal. So you've accelerated the progress to meet your objective to be carbon neutral by 2025, 5 years in advance. That's a great example for me of raising the ambition, but delivering on that ambition. I think what would be helpful is for you to tell us and other business leaders how you went about that. How did you create that acceleration? And then the second question for you, Jean-Pascal, from the audience is, how do you prepare the next generation of leaders, particularly at a time that we see COVID, if you like, creating almost the perfect training environment for leaders to understand how to manage crises differently and better in the future? So how do you manage that next generation of leaders as well? So if you could tackle those two things.
Yeah, Peter. Right. What we have focused the company on actually is technologies of energy and digital for sustainability. So you are asking, how do we raise the ambition in terms of SDG? I believe our companies have to lead by example and set bold bars or bold targets for our companies so that we show example and bring together our ecosystem of suppliers on partners. For as you said, in our case, we set the target to be carbon neutral by 2025 and actually to be net zero by 2030, which for comparating 200 factories, 100 distribution centers in more than 100 countries has been quite a challenge. But due to that, setting the bar really high, we go for technologies of disruption that we can bring to ourselves, but also to our customers. Second point, I don't think this is limited, by the way, in the field of environment and carbon footprint. We want also to set the bar high in terms of social commitments, in terms of pay equity, in terms of diversity and inclusion, in terms of gender diversity, and also bringing more future to the youth in the countries where we operate. So take the past years, we've trained more than 1 million underprivileged people to the business of being an electrician, to supply renewable energies to their community and to their villages. So that's what we try to do, set the bar high and lead by example, not only in environment, and our commitment to circularity, but also in the social commitment we have to the communities we live in. Second point, none of us can succeed really alone. So we at Schneider are operating with an ecosystem of partners, suppliers, integrators, customers, and we are really bringing them along and helping them to progress in terms of sustainability. And to that point, the Global Compact on the SDGs have been a formidable compass, because if your carbon footprint is a byproduct of your own footprint, but also of your supplier's footprint, then of course you need a common grammar on a common compass so that we all work in the same direction. And this is what we have been doing now for more than 20 years. On linking that situation to the COVID, the first obsession we have had during the crisis of the COVID was one, to make sure that we were bringing the right continuity of service to our customers. We power most of the hospital, data centers, cold chain for food, pharmaceutical in the world, smart grid, water networks in the world, but also to make sure that the suppliers that work every day together would be able to go through the crisis. So we brought them PPEs, tools, and work with them together so that they could be keeping on working into that crisis. I do quite a lot of outdoor sports. In outdoor, what is important is that your body is going as well as you do, because otherwise you're stuck. You can be well. If the guy alongside you is not doing well, then you are in big trouble. So that's what we have been doing. How to raise the bar also, I would say for a company like ours, over 10 years, it's meant that we've completely twisted the strategy of the company or reoriented so that everything we do at Schneider is geared to the sustainability of our customers. And we've become the consultant in sustainability of many retail chain, energy companies, food and beverage companies, helping them to source better their energy, consume less, consume better, and recycle more. And when you manage to make that alignment between your strategy and on your objective of sustainability, then it becomes a real true acceleration. And finally, you were speaking about crisis, but unfortunately, it's not the first crisis we've met, but this one is global, while its declinations are local. There again, the first thing that we did was to create a special fund dedicated to the community or the people around us, so that not only we take care of our own needs, but also we would put together the communities where we operate the right tools or the right support to go through the crisis. So that's how I can summarize things. But at the end of the day, I would believe that what we've learned through this crisis, that what has worked has been places where local people were empowered because they could find solutions between themselves with our support. But you don't deal with a crisis in the same way in South Africa, in France, in Hong Kong, or in Singapore. So you have to be extremely local. On the communities where cases where you react the best are the places where you have trust. And that trust is not something you do by acceleration, it's something you create over time so that people feel they can really take their fate into their hands and find the solution they need for the communities and the company.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal. I think that helps a lot to reconcile the global consistency, but with local flexibility and the importance of trust in the business, in the areas where you do business.
You hear me, Peter?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Thank you.
Hopefully. Okay,
yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal. Helena, I wanted to turn to you for a second, and we've got a couple of questions coming in, and it'll help to move to the second component of the panel as well. So the SDG Ambition Program was set up by the United Nations Global Compact with Accenture, with SAP, to help to put in place a global framework that helps to integrate sustainable development goals into business strategy, into operations. And then importantly, in the second part, to help to better think about how we measure, how we set targets and goals, quantify the targets and progress against it. So that's the sort of the backdrop to some of the conversation. Now, Helena, what's coming in some of the conversation is, fast fashion is a tough industry, or the perception, perhaps, maybe not the reality, but the perception of fast fashion is a tough industry to integrate sustainability into. But I know you've been pioneering and working very hard on setting ambitious circular economy targets and with real underlying environmental goals and metrics and the like. Tell us a little bit more. You can feel free to challenge even the hypothesis that fast fashion and fashion are not sustainable, but also tell us how you've been pushing forward with measuring, managing, investing in circular.
Right. Okay. First to fast fashion. So we are here to contribute to meaningful growth, and with meaningful, obviously, we mean that it should have a meaning for people, communities, colleagues, customers, for our planet. And of course, we also need financial resilience to kind of keep on investing for a better tomorrow. Our business ID is fashion and quality at the best price in a sustainable way. And the price component is there because we've always been for the many, if that makes sense. So that is a way for us, if we can offer sustainability to the many, what if we could kind of offer that luxury to everyone? That is kind of what keeps us going. And yes, we have worked hard with setting targets and objectives. And I think that is a very effective way to also challenge yourself in how to move and develop your business model to become more resilient and more sustainable. And of course, representing a company such as the H&M Group to also inspire and raise the awareness amongst all our communities and customers, because that's when it becomes huge. So our experience in being vocal about bold targets has helped us a lot. And of course, when doing that, I think it's important that you have the vision very clear in your mind, and don't let kind of all the barriers and challenges stop you from making it vocal. Because I think that with these targets, it's absolutely impossible to set them, if you should have the roadmap clear, you have to kind of allow yourself to have unanswered questions. And all of these kind of objectives demand a lot of collaboration, which I think is important to acknowledge. So if we take a few examples, if we take fair living wages, a goal that we set quite some years ago, we knew that that was a super sensitive question in our industry, but we also saw for us, it's really important for us to kind of look into even more, how can we contribute? Because we stand for something, and how do we kind of make sure that we have a greater impact? And we started to set that goal knowing that this is not something we can do alone. But as we went on to try to reach that goal on fair living wages, we started to collaborate much, much closer with our suppliers. And all of them now have fair living wage systems in their factories. And they have a much better kind of dialogue with their employees, so their voices can be heard and that they can negotiate. Also, we have 20 brands in our industry that came together and collaborated around purchasing practices, so that when we negotiate, we make sure that we don't touch the compensation component. Also, when we look at the climate goal, we started with science, saying that, okay, we know that global warming cannot go above plus 1.5 degrees. So what's our contribution to that, and how can we do that? And of course, we consulted a lot of experts in how to make it more of a science-based target. And then we looked at our kind of ambition internally in our own operations to go for efficiency, first of all, but then renewable. Now we have 96% renewable in our stores and offices and warehouses. But then where you really can drive impact is then in the full supply chain and with our customers, which kind of is all about collaboration and how you can deal with these things together. And looking forward, I think that goals will only become more and more important. But I think there will be maybe a different nature to the goals. I think resilience will be one part where more and more companies will see that it's a business necessity to integrate sustainability in your goals and in your future direction. I think the second one is about how do we collaborate with customers and inspire customers to come along with the journey, which I think demands more transparency so that they can see what's actually a sustainable choice. And the third one is that I think that the nature of goals will be much more collaborative because we're all building new type of partnerships. If I give one example, we have Treadler, a new business unit where we open up our supply chain. Due to many years of experience, we can kind of offer supply chain services to drive a sustainable future to more. And that kind of business unit will, of course, have to set more collaborative goals to move forward. So that I think will be really important in the near future.
Yeah, and I think look, that's a very, very rich response with some fantastic examples in there, Helena. Thank you for that. I think I took away a lot from that, but around the consumer engagement and the resilient corporation. But I also like your point about if you set bold targets and ambitions and goals, you have to be prepared to have unanswered questions. I think that's a great way to frame it. Right now, Sunny, moving on to you again. We can take it in a number of different directions, but I did want to come back. I thought it'd be fascinating between you and Titi to talk a little bit about how you take investors on the journey here, right? Because in some cases there are significant, investments that need to be made. There are benefits and business cases, I think, as Helena's talked about, potentially with the customer, with suppliers, and with other partners. But sometimes, the payback is slower, and sometimes it's something you decide to do because it's the right thing, not necessarily the economic thing. How have you're the biggest of your industry on the Singapore Stock Exchange. You obviously have an important dialogue with investors. How do you manage that journey? as you set bold ambitions and targets?
You need to speak the investor's language. If you say sustainability is one silo on its own and value creation over the long term for shareholders is another silo on its own, and you don't show a direct link between the two, then you will fail in bringing on board investors, board members, etc., who want to see a direct link between doing good and doing well. So you need to, therefore, firstly redefine the notion of value. It is not just about financial and economic capital that you need to be focused on, but all the other drivers that will create long-term financial and economic capital. And that includes measuring the externalities like natural capital. So if you are going to distribute 28 million seedlings, cocoa seedlings to farmers in Cote d'Ivoire or in Ghana, and you're giving them 1.3 million shade trees to be planted as part of the agroforestry program, or you're building 41 schools in that region, or you're giving them $136 million last year of incremental premiums for producing a better and more sustainable cocoa, then you have to show to your shareholders and your board that by doing all of this, we are building and accreting social capital with our farmers. We are building and accreting natural capital because we are reducing the carbon emission intensity. So if you're looking at the increased tree crop cover through your shade trees or through your replantation, reforestation efforts, all of that is building natural capital. And unless you can measure them and say that there is a direct link between these various other alternative capitals to eventually drive economic and financial capital, then you won't bring them on board. If you show that direct correlation between these other capitals, natural capital, social capital, human capital. So if I spend $40–50 million on employee development, training, and all that stuff, and it appears as a line item in my P&L statement as an expense, but the increased inspiration scores, the increased engagement scores, the increased productivity is going to translate into increased economic value over the long term. But unless I can measure the human capital in terms of the value of the engagement scores, inspiration scores, low attritions, higher skill and capability, I won't be able to show that link. So we have now adopted a multiple capital reporting structure where we look at financial and economic capital, but also measuring natural and social capital, human capital, intellectual capital, intangible capital, and saying that all of this drives. And the other big piece is employees in the company today are not going to be inspired because they're joining Olam and they can sell more cocoa or coffee or become part of the world's largest cocoa team or coffee team. They're saying all of this overwhelming effort that we are asked to put in the company, if it doesn't mean something is not going to create a difference, we don't really care. So unless they know that what they're doing is going to change our company, change our sector, potentially change the world, they're not going to be walking on the balls of the feet or coming to work with a real cause or a problem to solve. And that is why for us, bringing all this together is important. And also measurement is important. When I talked about the earlier section, that the biodiversity targets, 147 targets, or the 230 targets in the UN SDGs, not all of them have a common definition of how you're going to measure it, how you're going to define it, what methodology. There's no standardized methodology. There's no measurement. And as managers and leaders, we know that if you don't measure something, you can't really manage or improve on it. So how do you get focused on outcomes and not just outputs and measure it and report it? Unless every country is required to report the 230 UN SDG targets or the 147 biodiversity targets, and we have a common methodology, how the hell can we have change? We cannot have change.
So, Sonny, I think that's a brilliant articulation of the need for us to get better at measuring and managing and being able to bring people on the journey with facts and with figures and with real rigor, in the same way that we do with financial ledger as well. So very helpful. So we've got 10 minutes to go. Next question, I'm going to come to Jean-Pascal to talk about what he wants from governments. But let me ask Fani just to come in on that. Are you convinced as an investor, as an asset manager, with what Sonny and Helena have said? How would you recommend people take investors and asset managers and the like on the journey?
I think as a general comment, we have have made a significant progress with respect to how investors think of sustainability. If you were at Davos in January, February, the driving idea around inclusive capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, that sustainability is key, including climate, to making decisions. If you take that back, at the end of the day, if you're Carl Purse and you manage the pensions of workers in California, or you are the Public Investment Corporation in South Africa managing, again, the pensions of general workers in the country, or you're BlackRock and Larry Fink, the largest manager of investment assets in the world, these issues have become particularly important. So disclosure is important, measurement is important, and the sense that you have to be long-term in what you do has now become accepted. So as an asset manager, as a bank, we do think there is a real opportunity in ESG investing on the one hand, but also in SDG type investing as we go forward. We've seen a proliferation on stock market, on green bonds, for instance, on green funds. As an example, at Investec, we have launched a fund called Revigo, which invests in renewable energy. So I think the moment has come where business leaders, from banks to leaders of large corporations, large multinationals, have come to accept that we have to be inclusive in terms of capitalism and growth, that the health of our workers, the health of our communities is really important as we move forward. So I think the skepticism that was there around business has reduced significantly, and it is a critical moment for us to up our ambitions in terms of asking of these business leaders to step forward. Investec is one such investor. We are one such business, and commitment is quite clear, and we will work with our clients to continue to push their agenda. It makes business sense to be sustainable today.
Thank you very much, Fani, and hopefully, by the sound of it, it's a long journey, and it takes many different components in a system as complex as global capital markets. But to Sunny's point, the redefinition of value seems to be beginning, and that conversation, I think, will be enhanced by the quality of goals, ambitions, more quantification in the markets that we're talking about here. Now, we're coming towards the end, but one of the questions I want to ask each of you, and I'll start with Jean-Pascal, is, and maybe about a minute or so each, but when we met in Davos to launch the SDG Ambition Program with Lise Kingo, with Julie Sweet and others, we were lucky enough to have the Secretary General there, and he kicked it off. And one of the very, very clear calls to action that he had at the end of the session, I think a couple of you were in the room, was that business needs to be able to stand up and be counted not only as business, but increasingly we need to see business leaders clear with governments about what they need and what they expect in order to achieve the SDGs faster, at scale and at speed. And so I wanted to give you all a minute or so just to give your view on what you want to see from governments, hard measures, soft measures. What do you need to be able to do more? Jean-Pascal, you work with lots of governments. You work in many geographies around the world. What would you recommend and what would you ask for from governments?
You're on mute. Jean-Pascal, you're on mute.
I think you're on, Jean-Pascal. I think you're on mute still.
So I'm unmuted now. Okay.
Yeah, now you're perfect. Yeah, you're good.
I'm not in mute now. Is that okay or not? Yeah, right.
Correct. You're
okay,
fine.
Sorry
you're
for
fine.
that. Yeah, I think we should work more with the government. And if I try to summarize, I would expect the government to accelerate the change. So take away because what we are speaking about is a big change. It's visit a lot of things that we are doing in one way that we have to do in another way. So stop giving incentives to the thing of really putting the incentives on the thing of the future. And you see that in my sector, like fossil fuel subsidies have to be taken away. Investment in renewable energy efficiency has to be encouraged. So really accelerate and change the paradigm faster than we do today.
Very good, Jean-Pascal. Thank you very much. Remove subsidies in fossil fuels, accelerate the energy transition. Let's come to Sunny second, please.
Three things. One is an enabling policy framework. First, in terms of carbon tax. Anything that is free, we will use indiscriminately. Carbon is free, we pollute indiscriminately. Second, mandatory disclosures on footprints. Carbon, waste, water to start with. Third, partnership with private sector. Not to see private sector as enemies. So I'll give you a very quick example. In the COVID time, in the Eastern Province, Highlands in Papua New Guinea, where we buy coffee from, it's very remote. There is no social media presence or network of any kind. So thousands of farmers didn't know what safe distancing, social distancing, wearing masks, etc. were. We got the government involved in training pastors. 750 pastors were trained in 3 weeks in their churches and in their communities to talk about social distancing, safe distancing, masks, helping them prepare masks, etc. So I think there has to be a tighter collaboration and partnership with government and private sector.
Excellent. Very clear, Sunny. Thank you very much. Helena, your ask of governments.
There has been wonderful suggestions already when it comes to climate. So then I choose to put my request around human rights and justice. And I think that all governments should really look at an, collective ambition and aspiration in what is it that we have to do. And I think that has to be done in a collaborative manner. So how do we remove the borders and work across for more justice and, of course, something that is really basic for human rights?
Thank you very much, Helena. And finishing with Fani, tell us what would your recommendation and ask be of government to accelerate sustainable development in business?
Look, I obviously do agree with what my colleagues have said. I think if we're going to achieve the ambitions that have been set, it has to be a multilateral effort. So as opposed to repeating what has been said, I would want rather to make an appeal to business that we have to continue to foster an environment of building trust. We cannot do it on our own. Governments cannot do it on their own. In fact, you also have to bring civil society into it. A partnership mentality to build trust in the long term is really important. I think if we take that approach going forward and build trust, we can get better policy outcomes, we can get better decisions made that allow us to move forward much better, and we can make a real impact on the achievement of the SDGs.
Thank you, Fani. And I think a number of you, in fact, I think all of you have mentioned that issue of collaboration and trust in different formats, whether it's in value chains or across even competitive landscapes. That 17th goal of partnerships and collaboration with government, with civil society and business is really the only way we can get to the systemic answers that we need in order to accelerate and to get to the SDGs at speed and scale. Let me say a huge thank you to all of our panelists. I thought that was a very rich and concrete dialogue that I hope has given people food for thought. Let me congratulate and thank the UN Global Compact team for putting this on. Again, there's a lot of hard work that goes on in the background, and particularly Lise Kingo, who is ending her team. I want to pay tribute to the work that she's done to support, I think, many of us in helping to raise the bar over the last 5 years. The SDG Ambition Program, which is an initiative of the Global Compact and Accenture and SAP, but really is an initiative of any of the businesses that would like to be part of that to help to better integrate the SDGs into business strategy, into operations and into measurement, is an open platform, an open approach. So if any of you would like to join or know more, please do be in touch. And again, we wish you all the success in raising your own SDG ambition. Thank you very much.